under the cliffs west of Luxor, where the desert folds into dry valleys and the evening light turns the limestone the colour of old bone, a staircase appears where there should be only rubble. It does not lead into a glittering chamber filled with gold. It does not open on a king lying untouched beneath a perfect painted sky. It descends instead into damage, silence, and stubborn traces, broken plaster, fallen stone, fragments of alabaster, bits of blue paint. Yellow stars scattered like the remains of a sky that once promised eternity. For millennia, water has been here, rushing through a place built for dryness, pouring into a royal tomb with the blunt force of the desert when it suddenly remembers rain. And in 2025, after years of excavation and careful study, this wounded tomb, known as C4 in Wadi C, is identified as the burial place of Pharaoh Thutmose II, one of the last missing kings of Egypt's 18th dynasty. The discovery does not feel like the closing of a file. It feels like the opening of a door. The strange power of this tomb is not that it is complete. It is that it is incomplete in exactly the way ancient Egypt often is. The pharaohs built for forever, but forever has bad weather, shifting politics, collapsing ceilings, and the long patience of sand. Tomb C4 sits in the western Wadis, in a landscape that looks empty only to those who do not know how to read it. The cliffs are cut by gullies where floodwater can rage after rare storms. The slopes hold hidden entrances and burial places once chosen because they were remote, sacred, and difficult to reach. Here, Egypt's kings and queens tried to disappear into stone, hoping secrecy could protect what grandeur could not. Yet the same landscape that guarded them also betrayed them. What survives in the record suggests that Thutmose II's tomb was flooded soon after burial, its passages choked, its plaster torn from the walls, its contents likely moved elsewhere in antiquity. That detail changes the mood of the discovery. Modern imaginations often expect Egyptian tombs to behave like sealed treasure boxes, waiting politely for archaeologists with cameras and soft brushes. Tomb C4 offers something more honest. It is a royal monument ruined less by dramatic robbery than by water, instability, and ancient emergency. The archaeologists did not simply step into a chamber and see a name glowing on a wall. They worked through debris, damage, and ambiguity. At first, the tomb's position near burials associated with royal women made it seem possible that it belonged to a queen or a high-ranking woman of the court. Only gradually did the clues gather weight. Fragments of alabaster vessels carried the name of Thutmose II and the name of Hatshepsut, his great royal wife. Remains of decoration pointed toward kingship sections of the Amduat, the guide through the hidden hours of the night, and the blue ceiling with yellow stars. The artificial heaven beneath which a dead ruler was meant to travel with the sun. It is difficult not to pause over that ceiling. The real sky above Wadi C is vast, cold, and indifferent at night. But inside the tomb the Egyptians made another sky, one controlled and painted above the body of a king, blue for the celestial deep, yellow stars for an ordered cosmos. The tomb becomes not simply a grave but a machine of rebirth, a sacred interior map where death is not an ending but a dangerous passage. The Amduat, with its journey through the 12 hours of night, belongs to this same logic. The sun disappears every evening, travels through darkness, faces dangers, and rises again. A pharaoh, if properly prepared, may join that cycle. The evidence remains incomplete, but even broken fragments preserve the ambition. Ancient Egyptian kingship is never only politics. It is theology carved into geology. Thutmose II himself is a quiet figure to stand at the threshold of such a large story. He's not as famous as Khufu, who was tied forever to the Great Pyramid. He's not as dazzling as Tutankhamun, whose tomb turned the modern world's eyes toward golden masks and nested coffins. He is overshadowed by Hatshepsut, the royal wife who later rules as king, and by Thutmose III, who becomes one of Egypt's great imperial pharaohs. Thutmose II seems to occupy a narrow bridge between larger personalities. A short reign in the early 18th dynasty, a life partly hidden behind the achievements of those around him. Scholars still debate details of his age, reign length, and the identity of remains traditionally associated with him. That uncertainty makes the tomb more haunting, not less. It belongs to a king history almost allowed to vanish between the shadows of his family. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history you enjoy. This discovery matters because it reminds us how fragile the pharaohs' immortality was. They commanded labour, stone, gold, scribes, priests, soldiers, farmers, quarrymen, artists, and entire systems of belief. They claimed a place among gods, yet sometimes their survival in history depends on a broken vessel in a flood-damaged corridor, on a flake of painted plaster, on a name preserved where time failed to erase it. Egypt's kings tried to turn memory into architecture, but archaeology often recovers them through accidents. There is also a quiet irony in the phrase lost tomb. To modern eyes, the tomb is lost because maps did not show it, because generations of explorers searched elsewhere, because the entrance lay hidden beneath debris until the 21st century. But in ancient terms, it may not have remained lost at all. Someone may have known it had flooded. Someone may have entered while the disaster was still fresh. Someone may have removed the burial equipment, and perhaps the body. Through a passage made or adapted for rescue, the tomb may have failed almost immediately as an eternal house, and yet that failure preserved the mystery. No single explanation fully accounts for everything that happened there. Was the king moved to another tomb? Were objects scattered, reused, protected, or lost? Did priests centuries later know the original story? Or did even they inherit only fragments? The answers lie somewhere between geology, ritual, and human decision. From this damaged chamber, the whole rise and fall of the pharaohs begins to feel less like a clean procession of dynasties, and more like a long struggle against disappearance. Egypt is famous for endurance, and rightly so. Its civilization lasts across thousands of years, longer than most empires can imagine themselves lasting. But endurance is not the same as stillness. Thrones pass through weak hands and powerful ones. Capitals shift. Gods rise and fall in favour. Tombs change shape. Foreigners enter Egypt, sometimes as traders, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as rulers. The Nile gives rhythm, but not certainty. The desert protects, but not perfectly. Even a royal burial under a painted heaven can drown. So the story begins not with a perfect monument, but with a damaged one, a tomb that tells us Egypt's past is still being assembled piece by piece. The pharaohs are not simply waiting in textbooks, fixed and finished. They are still emerging from cliffs, caches, museum storerooms, old excavation notes, chemical tests, CT scans, DNA laboratories, and desert valleys where a single broken object can rearrange a dynasty. Thutmose II's tomb stands at the edge of that revelation, modest and battered, but alive with implication. Beneath its ruined stars is the central truth of ancient Egypt: every king sought eternity. Yet every trace of eternity had to survive the world. The flood came, the body vanished, the walls broke. Still, the name remained. long before the blue stars were painted above Thutmose II, long before royal tombs retreated into hidden valleys west of Thebes, Egypt's kings were buried in a world that did not yet know the pyramid. The idea of the pharaoh did not descend fully formed from the sky. It grew out of mud, grain, cattle, river journeys, rival chiefs, painted pottery, sacred animals, desert cemeteries, and the slow discovery that a dead ruler could remain powerful if the living arranged his memory correctly. In the beginning, before Egypt becomes the Egypt of colossal statues and golden masks, death is already a language. Graves speak of status. Objects placed beside bodies speak of relationships, work, travel, food, beauty, and belief. And among those graves, a few begin to speak louder than the rest. The earliest rulers of the Nile Valley do not yet stand before the world as god-kings in the later sense. They are local powers, regional leaders, men whose authority seems tied to land, cattle, ritual, and control of movement along the river. The evidence remains incomplete, because the earliest phases of Egyptian state formation are preserved in scattered cemeteries, disturbed tombs, symbols that are difficult to read, and artifacts whose meanings can shift depending on context. Yet what survives in the record suggests a gradual intensification of power. Graves become larger, burial goods become richer. Some tombs begin to require coordinated labour beyond the household or village. Certain people are not simply buried, they are installed into the afterlife with equipment, offerings, and architecture that announce their rank even after breath has left the body. This is one of the quieter revolutions in human history. Before a ruler can build a pyramid, people must accept that his death matters to the whole community. Before stone can rise into the shape of eternity, a society must believe that a royal body deserves separation, protection, and repeated attention. In pre-dynastic Egypt, especially in places such as Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, archaeology reveals a world experimenting with hierarchy. Painted pottery travels with the dead. Ivory tags and early marks hint at administration. Exotic materials show contact beyond a local village. Boats appear as symbols and sometimes as real funerary structures, reminding us that the Nile is not merely water, but a road between worlds. Even before formal writing becomes fully visible, the dead are being organized into a social map. A lesser-known detail is that some of the earliest royal and elite burial traditions seem to treat the desert edge as a sacred threshold. The living inhabit the fertile black land near the Nile, where irrigation, fields, and settlements depend on the flood. The dead often move toward the red land, the dry desert margin, where bodies and offerings have a better chance of surviving. This contrast later becomes one of Egypt's deepest symbolic divisions: black land and red land, order and wilderness, life and danger, cultivation and eternity. But in the earlier cemeteries, the contrast is practical as well as sacred. Dry sand preserves, distance protects. A grave beyond the fields becomes part of a landscape already removed from ordinary life. The discoveries reported in 2026 from Jabal al-Tair in the Minya region fit into this long beginning, nearly 5,000 years old. These early dynastic tombs belong to the period when kingship, burial architecture, and central authority are still taking shape. They are not pyramids, and that is precisely why they matter. They stand closer to the origin of the idea than to its most famous expression. Before the stepped pyramid of Djoser, before the smooth sides of Giza, before the royal tomb becomes a mountain built by the state, there are tombs that show how Egyptians are learning to make death architectural: stone, mud brick, chamber layout, burial equipment, and location all become ways of saying that some lives continue to matter after death in a larger, organized, public way. The line from these early tombs to the pyramids is not simple, and scholars still debate the precise sequence of influences, innovations, and regional traditions. It would be too neat to imagine one architect looking at one old grave and inventing the pyramid in a single stroke. Ancient Egypt rarely works that way. Its greatest forms are often accumulations. A mastaba becomes more complex. A burial chamber gains a superstructure. A mound becomes a symbol of emergence. A king's tomb becomes a state project. Ritual grows around architecture, and architecture gives ritual a more commanding body. The pyramid is not born only from engineering, it is born from generations of experimentation with how to make royal death visible, durable, and cosmic. In the earliest dynasties, this experimentation becomes more formal. Abydos, especially the royal cemetery at el-Kab, preserves the memory of some of Egypt's first kings. Names such as Nama, Aha, Ja, Jet, Den, and Kwa belong to a world in which writing, kingship, and administration begin to fasten themselves together. These rulers are not just buried with fine objects, they are buried within a system of identity. Royal names appear in serech frames, linked to the falcon god Horus. The king is not merely a strong man with followers, he's becoming a sacred office, a point where human rule and divine order meet. The tomb helps make that transformation believable. Still, the grandeur of early kingship has a shadow. Royal tombs concentrate labor and wealth. They make authority visible, but they also reveal dependence on many unnamed people, farmers who produce surplus, craft workers who shape vessels and tools, officials who count goods, boatmen who move materials, ritual specialists who maintain memory, and families whose lives are drawn into the orbit of the court. The pharaoh's eternity is built from ordinary time. Every jar, mat, bead, seal impression. And brick belongs to human hands. Egypt's later monuments can sometimes make power seem effortless, as if stone obeyed kings by nature. Early tombs correct that illusion. They show kingship still being assembled, piece by people learning how to live under a larger order. There is something haunting in this phase because the future is visible only to us. The builders of an early dynastic tomb do not know that later generations will raise pyramids at Saqqara and Giza. They do not know that royal burial will move from open monumental forms to hidden chambers cut into western cliffs. They stand at the beginning of a chain, but they cannot see the chain. They know only that a ruler has died, offerings must be placed, the tomb must be prepared, and the order of the world must continue. That is why these early burials are not simply archaeological background. They are the first whispers of the pharaonic obsession with permanence. In them, Egypt discovers that power can outlive the body if it is tied to land, ritual, writing, and architecture. The king becomes larger after death, not smaller. The tomb becomes a place where political authority and sacred imagination reinforce one another. What begins as a grave at the desert's edge will eventually become a pyramid on the horizon, then a hidden valley tomb painted with the underworld, then a museum gallery where millions stare at objects made for one man's eternity. The forms change, but the question remains the same. How can a human life be made to survive time? The answer, in early Egypt, is not yet gold. It is not yet the Great Pyramid. It is a chamber, a mound, a body carefully placed, a name marked, a set of offerings arranged against forgetting. It is the first belief that royal death can become public memory. And from that belief, the long road to the pharaohs begins. The first belief that royal death can become public memory depends on something even older than kingship, the river that makes Egypt possible. Long before a pharaoh can command stone or priests can recite the names of gods in dark chambers, the Nile is already teaching people how to measure time, how to survive scarcity, how to wait, how to plan, and how to imagine order in a world that might otherwise feel unstable. Egypt does not rise because the land is easy. It rises because the land is sharply divided. On either side of the valley lies desert, bright and severe, a world of rock, heat, hidden minerals, and dangerous distance. Between those deserts runs a green thread of silt and water, narrow in places, wider in others, renewed by floods that arrive from far beyond Egypt itself. To live here is to understand that civilization is not spread evenly across the earth. It is gathered, compressed, and focused along the river bank. The Nile gives Egypt a rhythm that few ancient lands possess with such clarity. Each year, the floodwaters rise, carrying dark silt from distant highlands and laying it across the fields. When the waters withdraw, they leave behind soil rich enough to feed villages, temples, workers, and kings. The cycle is not a simple gift, because too little water means hunger and anxiety, while too much can damage settlements and erase boundaries. Still, compared with rainfall farming in more uncertain regions, the Nile offers a pattern that can be watched, remembered, predicted, and eventually administered. The river does not create the Egyptian state by itself, but it creates the conditions in which centralized power becomes unusually useful. Someone must organize canals, storage, field boundaries, labor, transport, taxation, and offerings. Someone must measure the flood and interpret its meaning. Someone must decide how abundance moves from one place to another. Over time, that someone becomes the court, the temple, the bureaucracy, and finally the pharaoh. This is one reason Egypt developed such a strong idea of order. The world seems to divide itself into clear categories: black land and red land, river and desert, flood and drought, cultivation and wilderness, settled life and dangerous margins. Later Egyptians call cosmic balance ma'at, a word that carries ideas of truth, justice, right order, and the proper arrangement of things. It is tempting to make ma'at sound abstract, but in the Nile Valley it is also practical: a broken canal, a failed harvest, a disputed border between fields, a dishonest measure of grain, or a neglected ritual can all feel like small cracks in the same structure. The king's role grows from this vision. He does not merely rule people, he protects the pattern that allows life to continue. The geography reinforces that belief. Egypt is not sealed off from the world, but it is naturally framed. The Mediterranean lies to the north, the deserts to the east and west, and the first cataract near Aswan forms a southern threshold rather than a clean wall. These borders do not make Egypt isolated, they make Egypt legible. Movement is easier along the river than across the deserts, so political authority tends to stretch north and south. Boats can travel with the current downstream, while sails catch northern winds to move upstream, creating a natural two-way highway. That detail is easy to miss, but it matters deeply. The Nile is not just a source of water, it is a transportation system designed by geography itself, carrying people, stone, grain, soldiers, officials, cattle, timber, incense, news, commands, and royal ideology. The river also teaches scale. A village can feed itself, but a kingdom can move surplus. A local chief can control a bend of the Nile, but a pharaoh claims the whole valley. When the early state begins to consolidate, it is not only conquering territory, it is joining the river into a single political imagination. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt become more than regions. They become symbolic halves of a united world, the double crown, the sedge and bee, the paired lands. The repeated language of unification, all of this rests on a real geographical fact. Egypt is long, narrow, and dependent on coordination. Its unity is both a political achievement and an environmental solution. Yet the Nile's order should not be mistaken for simplicity. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a land full of local identities, regional traditions, and practical tensions. The delta is not the same as the southern valley. Marshlands, cattle zones, trade routes, temples, and cemeteries vary from place to place. The western desert connects to oases and distant peoples. The eastern desert opens routes toward the Red Sea and mineral zones. Nubia to the south is both neighbour and rival, source of goods and power, and later a region deeply entangled with Egyptian ambition. Sinai provides copper and turquoise. The Levant offers timber, oils, resins, and contact with other ancient societies. Even in its earliest periods, Egypt stands in a network, not a sealed chamber. Scholars still debate the scale and timing of many contacts, especially in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic centuries, but the broad picture is clear. Egypt's strength grows from the river, while its horizons extend far beyond the river. This outward reach becomes part of pharaonic identity. To rule Egypt is to command the valley, but also to control movement at its edges. Expeditions go into the deserts for stone and minerals. Trade reaches north and east. Objects from far away appear in elite contexts, not as casual curiosities but as signs that power can gather the rare and distant. A ruler who brings back cedar, incense, gold, copper, or exotic stone is not simply collecting luxury. He is showing that the ordered world under his authority reaches beyond the green floodplain into places of danger and value. The desert, once the opposite of cultivated life, becomes a storehouse of royal possibility. In daily life, this grand structure depends on quieter routines. Farmers watch the river, scribes measure fields and record grain, boatmen know currents, winds, sandbanks, and landing places. Craft workers transform river clay, desert stone, imported wood, linen, metal, and pigment into objects that move through households, temples, and tombs. Priests keep calendars tied to festivals and celestial patterns. Officials travel with instructions and seals. Villagers live close to animals, fields, ovens, workshops, and local shrines. The pharaoh may be the visible summit of this world, but the kingdom is made from repetition. Each season renews the bargain between water and labour. A surprising detail is that Egypt's confidence in eternity grows out of a landscape that is never fully secure. The Nile is regular enough to inspire trust, but variable enough to demand vigilance. The desert preserves bodies and monuments, but also erases paths and buries settlements. The same dry air that saves painted wood can turn human memory brittle. The same river that feeds the fields can undermine mud brick and sweep away traces of ordinary lives. Egypt's order is powerful because disorder is always close. The pharaoh becomes necessary not because the world is calm, but because it is not. From this tension comes the emotional force of Egyptian kingship. A ruler stands between flood and famine, desert and field, gods and people, death and rebirth. He is expected to make the world behave as it should. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of such a durable civilization, because environment, belief, labor, administration, violence, trade, and imagination all work together. But the Nile gives the story its spine. It gathers communities into one corridor of life. It makes time visible. It turns the movement of water into calendars, taxes, rituals, journeys, and myths. It allows kings to dream in stone because fields can produce surplus and boats can move weight across distance. And once that happens, the early tomb at the desert edge can become something larger. A grave can become a monument. A chief can become a god-king. A river valley can become Egypt. Once the Nile Valley can be imagined as one ordered world, the ruler at its center begins to change. He is no longer only the strongest chief, or the most successful war leader, or the owner of the largest granaries. He becomes the point where the human and divine worlds touch. In early Egypt, this transformation does not happen in a single coronation. It unfolds through symbols, ceremonies, monuments, names, clothing, crowns, rituals, and the repeated claim that one person can hold the two lands together because he stands inside a cosmic pattern, larger than ordinary politics. The pharaoh is not merely a king who asks the gods for help. He is presented as the living guarantor of Ma'at, the one whose rule makes order visible. This is one of the most important inventions in Egyptian history, and also one of the hardest to reconstruct from the earliest evidence. The evidence remains incomplete, because the first dynasties leave behind objects that speak in compressed symbols, carved palettes, mace heads, seal impressions, labels, tomb goods, fragments of ceremonial scenes, and names enclosed in royal frames. These are not simple documents in the modern sense. They are statements of power made through images. A ruler smites an enemy. A falcon watches over a name. A crown marks one half of the land, then another. Animals march in controlled rows. Captives appear as signs of conquered disorder. Scholars still debate how literally some of these scenes should be read. They may record real conflicts, ritual performances, ideological claims, or all three at once. But their message is unmistakable. The king stands above chaos, and his authority is more than personal force. The famous image of the smiting pharaoh begins early and lasts for thousands of years. A king raises a weapon over a subdued enemy, while divine symbols approve the act. To modernize, the scene can look like simple royal propaganda, and in one sense it is. Yet in Egyptian thought, the scene is also ritualized. The enemy is not only a human opponent, he represents disorder at the edge of the world, the threat that must be contained if fields are to grow, temples are to function, and the sun is to rise properly. This does not make ancient warfare gentle or symbolic in real life, but it helps explain why the image is repeated so stubbornly. The pharaoh's political victories are folded into the cosmic story. Rule becomes sacred maintenance. The early pharaoh's identity is built from layers. One layer is the Horus name, linking the king to the falcon god who soars above the land. Another is the idea of the two ladies, goddesses connected with Upper and Lower Egypt. Later, the full royal titulary grows into a formal set of names, each carrying theological and political meaning. A king does not simply have a name, he has a sacred identity written into the structure of the world. His crowns work the same way. The white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, and the combined double crown are not just ornaments. They are declarations that unity has been achieved and must be renewed. Every time the king appears in these forms, He performs the idea that Egypt is one country made from two complementary lands. A lesser-known detail is how much early kingship depends on small administrative objects as well as monumental images. Clay ceilings, labels, and storage marks may seem modest beside pyramids, but they reveal the machinery behind sacred power. A seal impressed on a jar or door tells us goods are controlled. Officials are active, names matter, and authority can travel beyond the physical presence of the ruler. The king's power is not only seen in a ceremonial palette, it is felt in the counted jar of oil, the marked shipment of grain, the stored cloth, the sealed room, the official who carries instructions. Divine kingship needs bureaucracy. Eternity, as usual, has paperwork. The palace, temple, and tomb begin to form a triangle of royal power. The palace is where commands emerge, where officials gather, where prestige concentrates around the living ruler. The temple is where the relationship between king and gods is enacted, where offerings maintain divine favor and ritual language gives political authority a sacred frame. The tomb is where kingship survives death, where the ruler's body and name are protected so that his power can continue in another form. These institutions are not always easy to separate in the earliest periods, and their development varies across time and place. But by the time pharaonic culture becomes fully recognizable, they support one another. The living king serves the gods. The dead king joins the divine realm. The next king inherits a world already charged with sacred obligation. The pharaoh's body becomes central to this system. Unlike ordinary rulers who may be remembered mainly by laws or battles, the Egyptian king is bound to physical preservation. The body is not simply a corpse to be hidden away. It is a sacred vessel requiring care, ritual, wrapping, offerings, protection, and a properly designed resting place. Mummification develops gradually, from natural drying in desert sand to increasingly elaborate artificial preservation. No single explanation fully accounts for its rise, because practical preservation, religious belief, elite display, and changing funerary theology all interact. But the royal body becomes especially important because it anchors continuity. The king dies, yet kingship does not. The body is transformed, the successor appears, the rituals continue, and Egypt tells itself that order has not been broken. This idea reaches into time itself. Egyptian kings are placed in sequences, remembered in lists, linked to predecessors, and measured by reigns. Royal annals, later king lists, and temple inscriptions all show an obsession with continuity. Though these records are selective and sometimes political, rulers can be emphasized, ignored, rearranged, or erased. Memory is not neutral in ancient Egypt, it is managed. A king's legitimacy depends partly on his place in the chain. To rule is to inherit not just land, but the accumulated weight of all earlier kings. The first god-kings create a pattern that later pharaohs must inhabit, even when they bend it, exploit it, or fail to live up to it. The sacred nature of kingship also creates a problem that never fully disappears. If the pharaoh is the guarantor of order, then disorder becomes a judgment on kingship. A poor flood, famine, invasion, civil conflict, or weak administration can be understood not only as misfortune but as a crack in the cosmic arrangement. Egyptian texts often present kings as victorious and divinely favored, but archaeology and historical reconstruction reveal periods of strain beneath the polished surface. This tension gives pharaonic rule its dramatic force. The king is elevated above ordinary humanity, yet he remains dependent on human systems, food production, loyalty, scribes, soldiers, labourers, priests, trade, and the cooperation of local elites. He is divine in ideology, but vulnerable in history. Still, the idea proves astonishingly durable. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt returns again and again to the image of the pharaoh as protector of Maat. Dynasties change, capitals move, foreign rulers take Egyptian titles, priests gain power, empires rise and shrink. Yet the office survives because it offers a language through which authority can be made sacred and continuity can be imagined after crisis. The first god-kings do more than rule early Egypt. They create a role so powerful that later conquerors will try to wear it like a crown fitted by the gods themselves. And so, from the river's rhythm and the early tombs at the desert edge, a new kind of ruler steps forward. He wears symbols older than any one man. He stands beneath the falcon, between the two lands, before gods who require offerings and people who require grain. His palace commands, his temple sanctifies, his tomb preserves. In him, Egypt joins politics to eternity. The pharaoh rises not only because he controls land, but because Egypt learns to see the land, the sky, the river, the dead, and the gods as parts of one order, and then places a king at its centre. The pharaoh at the centre of Egypt's sacred order needs a body for his power, something larger than a palace and more permanent than a ceremony. In the Old Kingdom, that body becomes stone. It rises from the desert west of the Nile in forms that still seem almost too simple to be human. Inventions a step, a slope, a triangle against the sun, a mountain made by hands. The pyramid is often treated as a mystery because it is immense, and immensity invites wild explanations. But its deeper mystery is not whether Egyptians could build it. They could, and the evidence of quarrying, tools, labour organisation, ramps, settlements, and administrative control makes that clear. The deeper mystery is why so much of a kingdom's imagination could gather round the death of one ruler, and why that death could be made to look like the horizon itself. The story begins not at Giza, but at Saqqara, where the step pyramid of Djoser rises like a staircase for a king who refuses to remain in the earth. Earlier royal tombs had already used mud brick chambers, offering spaces and symbolic architecture to separate the ruler from ordinary death. But under Djoser, in the third dynasty, the royal tomb becomes something unprecedented. The architect traditionally associated with this transformation is Imhotep, later remembered not only as a builder but almost as a sage. The step pyramid complex is not simply a tall tomb. It is a stone version of royal ritual, a permanent ceremonial world with courts, dummy buildings, chapels, enclosure walls, and carefully designed spaces. Much of it is not built for practical use in the ordinary sense. It is built for eternity, where symbolic architecture can serve a king forever. That is a lesser-known detail worth lingering over. At Saqqara, some structures imitate forms once made in perishable materials such as reeds, wood, and mud brick. Egypt is turning the temporary world into stone. What had once decayed with time is now made durable enough to outlive generations. This is not merely engineering progress. It is a change in how Egypt imagines permanence. The king's afterlife is not a private hope. It is a state-sponsored landscape. A ritual environment that says royal power can continue beyond death if the world is built properly around it. From Djoser's stepped form, later kings and builders experiment with smoother and more ambitious shapes. The pyramid evolves through attempts, corrections, and failures that are sometimes visible in the monuments themselves. At Medum, The structure associated with Sneferu may have collapsed or been transformed in ways still debated by scholars. At Dashur, the bent pyramid changes its angle partway up, as if the builders learned caution from the demands of height, weight, and stability nearby. The red pyramid achieves a more confident, smooth-sided form. These are not signs of ignorance. They are signs of a civilization pushing architecture into new territory, learning by doing, and accepting that royal eternity required practical solutions as much as sacred vision. By the time Khufu's Great Pyramid rises at Giza, the Old Kingdom has mastered a scale that still unsettles the eye. Blocks are quarried, transported, lifted, set, aligned, and dressed with a precision that makes the monument seem less built than revealed from the earth. Yet the pyramid is not alone. It belongs to a complex that includes temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, boat pits, cemeteries for officials, and eventually the wider necropolis of a court arranged around royal death. The king's pyramid is the centre, but it draws an entire society into orbit. Nobles want tombs nearby, priests maintain offerings, workers live in organised settlements, scribes track rations, cattle, beer, bread, tools, and labour teams. The dead pharaoh's monument becomes a permanent economic and ritual institution. The old image of enslaved masses dragging stones under whips is too simple and, in its common form, misleading. The labour behind the pyramids appears to have involved organised Egyptian workers, including rotating crews, skilled specialists, quarrymen, haulers, bakers, brewers, overseers, physicians, scribes, and administrators. That does not mean the work was easy or freely chosen in any modern sense. Ancient states could command labour power with little concern for individual preference. But the pyramid was not built by magic or by an anonymous swarm. It was built by a society with food systems, toolmakers, logistics, medical care, and pride in named work crews. Some crew names preserved from later pyramid contexts carry a startling human tone, as if teams had identities and rivalries beneath the grandeur. Eternity, once again, required organisation. What did the pyramid mean to those who saw it new? Its white limestone casing would have caught sunlight with a brightness almost lost to us now. It may have seemed less like a ruin, and more like a controlled sunrise placed on the desert edge. The shape can be read in several overlapping ways. It may echo the primeval mound, the first land emerging from the waters of chaos. It may resemble the rays of the sun, connecting the dead king to solar rebirth. It may function as a stairway, a symbolic ascent toward the sky. No single explanation fully accounts for the pyramid's meaning, because Egyptian religion often allowed symbols to layer rather than exclude one another. A monument could be mound, stair, sunbeam, tomb, political statement, and cosmic engine all at once. Inside, the pyramid is not a palace of gold, but a controlled passage toward transformation. Corridors, chambers, blocking stones, sarcophagus spaces, and ritual texts in later pyramids all belong to the difficult journey from death to divine existence. In the 5th and 6th dynasties, the pyramid texts appear on royal chamber walls, giving voice to spells, offerings, ascents, protections, and identifications with gods and stars. These texts are among the oldest large bodies of religious writing in the world. They reveal a royal afterlife filled not with vague peace but with movement, danger, appetite, power, and rebirth. The dead king does not simply sleep. He rises, joins the imperishable stars, travels with the sun, receives offerings, and becomes more than he was. Yet the Pyramid Age is also a political statement written in stone across the landscape. A king who can command such a monument demonstrates control over resources at a scale few rivals could match. Stone quarries must supply material. Fields must feed labourers. Boats must move blocks and goods. Officials must maintain schedules. Priests must define rituals. Artisans must create statues, reliefs, vessels, furniture, and burial equipment. The pyramid is the visible peak of an invisible system. It tells every viewer that the pharaoh does not merely rule from a palace. He can reorder land, labour, and belief around his own eternity. But grandeur has a cost. By the later Old Kingdom, pyramid construction changes. Monuments become smaller. Provincial elites grow more visible. Local tombs and inscriptions suggest a world in which power is spreading away from the centre. Climate stress, low Nile floods, administrative strain, shifting wealth, and political decentralization have all been proposed as factors in the Old Kingdom's decline. Scholars still debate the balance among them, and the evidence remains incomplete. It is unlikely that one simple cause brought down the Pyramid Age. Civilizations rarely collapse from one crack. They weaken through many pressures that begin to reinforce one another. That is what makes the Old Kingdom dream so moving. It appears at first to be the most confident vision of kingship imaginable, a pharaoh as eternal as stone, a tomb as large as a mountain, a state disciplined enough to build for the afterlife. Yet even pyramids cannot freeze history. The kings who raised them are now fragments of names, bones, empty chambers, broken statues, and weathered causeways. Their monuments endured, but the system that built them changed. The pyramid remains on the horizon, but the living kingdom moves on, carrying both the memory of greatness and the strain of having believed that eternity could be organized like a royal work project. The Old Kingdom pyramids seem, at first glance, to belong to a country turned inward. Their mass faces the desert, their chambers close around royal bodies, their temples repeat rituals for dead kings, and their geometry feels so self-contained that Egypt can appear like a civilization sealed inside its own sacred imagination. But the stones tell a wider story. Egypt is never only Egypt, even in the age when pharaohs build mountains for their afterlife. The Nile Valley is connected to places beyond its fields, the deserts, the Red Sea, Nubia, the Levant, Sinai, the oases, the Mediterranean coast, and the older lands of Western Asia where cities, merchants, farmers, herders, and craftsmen are also shaping the ancient world. This matters because the rise of the pharaohs is sometimes imagined as a miracle that occurred in isolation, as if Egypt simply emerged complete from the Nile mud. The truth is more interesting. Egypt has a powerful internal rhythm, but its development unfolds within a web of exchange. The river gives it a spine, the deserts give it borders, and yet those borders are crossed constantly by people, goods, animals, ideas, symbols, and materials. Cedarwood from the Levant enters Egyptian elite culture because Egypt itself has little native timber suitable for great beams, ships, and certain high-status objects. Copper and turquoise from Sinai become part of royal expeditions and state control. Gold from the south helps feed the language of divine radiance. Obsidian, oils, resins, lapis-like blue stones, shells, and exotic animals move through networks that stretch far beyond the ordinary farmer's field. What survives in the record suggests not a closed kingdom, but a kingdom that defines itself partly by gathering the distant into the hands of the king. A striking modern clue comes from ancient DNA. In 2025, researchers published a genome from a man buried at Nuerat, dating to the Old Kingdom period, roughly the age when the pyramid building state has already taken shape. Ancient Egyptian DNA is difficult to recover because heat, humidity, burial conditions, and time are poor friends to genetic material. For a long time, the human bodies of ancient Egypt seemed to guard their genetic information as stubbornly as their tombs guarded names. This makes even one genome significant, though scholars still debate how much any single individual can represent a vast and diverse population. The results suggested ancestry mostly related to North Africa and Egypt, with a notable component connected to populations of the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia. The meaning must be handled carefully. One person does not rewrite all of Egyptian history, but the finding fits a larger pattern already visible in archaeology. Early Egypt is connected, mobile and aware of worlds beyond the Nile. That connection does not diminish Egypt's uniqueness, it makes it more believable. No great ancient civilization grows in a vacuum. Ideas travel unevenly, and not every resemblance proves borrowing, but contact creates possibilities, techniques, crops, animals, symbols, and prestige goods can move through trade, migration, diplomacy, intermarriage, imitation, and conquest. In the late prehistoric and early dynastic centuries, Egypt shares a broad Afro-Eurasian world where farming, herding, metallurgy, boat use, long-distance exchange, and administrative practices are all changing. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate which influences came from where and how strongly they shaped Egyptian development. But the old image of a sealed Egyptian miracle is too simple. Egypt is distinctive because it absorbs, transforms, and localizes what enters its world. The Nile itself helps create this pattern. It runs north toward the Mediterranean, opening Egypt toward the sea, while desert tracks and wadies connect the valley to mineral zones and foreign frontiers. Boats make internal transport easier than in many ancient lands, but they also carry Egypt toward contact. A royal expedition to Sinai is not just a mining trip. It is a statement that the pharaoh can reach beyond the cultivated land and command dangerous spaces. Reliefs and inscriptions from later periods show kings claiming victory over foreigners and control over borderlands. But behind the formal images lie practical needs: copper for tools and weapons, stone for vessels and monuments, timber for construction, incense for ritual, and luxury goods for royal display. Nubia is one of the most important of these connected regions. South of Egypt, along the Nile beyond the First Cataract, Nubian communities develop their own complex cultures, trade networks, burial traditions, and political powers. Egyptian texts often describe Nubia through the language of domination, tribute, and foreignness. But archaeology reveals a relationship far richer than royal boasting. Goods move both ways. People move both ways. Styles influence one another. Egypt desires Nubian gold, cattle, ivory, incense roots, and access to Central African products. Nubia watches Egypt, resists Egypt, trades with Egypt, and much later will even rule Egypt. In the Old Kingdom, Egyptian presence and interest in the south are already part of the state's outward vision. The pharaoh's world is not just the valley between desert walls, it is the chain of places through which value can be extracted, exchanged, and transformed into sacred power. To the northeast, the Levant offers another kind of connection. Timber is especially important. Egyptian monuments and tombs preserve a world in which wood can be as precious as stone because it must often come from far away. Cedar, in particular, becomes associated with elite construction and ships. Contacts with Byblos and other Levantine ports are part of Egypt's long relationship with the Eastern Mediterranean. This is not yet the later empire of the New Kingdom, when Egyptian armies marched deep into Western Asia. But the older foundation is already present. The pharaoh's court knows that some things needed for Egyptian greatness lie outside Egypt. Even the objects buried with the dead carry the scent of distance. A stone vessel may speak of quarrying in the eastern desert. A bead may speak of desert roots, craft specialization, or imported material. A wooden coffin may speak of trees that did not grow in the Nile Valley. A cosmetic palette, copper blade, seal, jar, or amulet may carry traces of techniques and materials that belong to wider exchange systems. Many of these objects seem small compared with pyramids, but they reveal the lived texture of connectivity. The ancient world is not divided into isolated boxes labelled Egypt, Mesopotamia, Nubia, and the Levant. It is a landscape of contact zones, frontiers, roots, gifts, rivalries, and long memories. The pharaoh uses these connections to strengthen the illusion of total order. Foreign goods become Egyptian when placed in Egyptian ritual settings. Imported wood becomes a royal boat. Desert stone becomes a temple vessel. Nubian gold becomes a skin of gods. Copper becomes tools for workers shaping monuments to eternal kingship. The outside world is not allowed to remain outside. It is drawn inward, renamed, purified, counted, sealed, stored, offered, and displayed. In this way, Egypt turns exchange into ideology. The more the king can gather from beyond the Nile, the more he appears to command the whole horizon. Yet this wider world also brings vulnerability. Trade routes can weaken, borders can become unstable, desert expeditions require security, foreign powers can rise, climate shifts can disturb connected economies, local elites who control access to resources can grow stronger. No single explanation fully accounts for the changes that follow the Great Pyramid Age. But Egypt's connections mean that its fortunes are tied not only to the river's flood, but also to networks of movement beyond the valley. A kingdom that draws strength from exchange can also feel pressure when exchange falters. So the Old Kingdom dream is both inward and outward. Its pyramids stand in the desert as if nothing beyond Egypt matters. Yet their construction depends on a world of roots, materials, people, and knowledge extending far from the plateau. The pharaoh's eternity is carved from Egyptian stone, fed by Egyptian grain, and sanctified by Egyptian gods. But it also glimmers with things gathered from beyond the borders. Egypt is never alone. It is a river kingdom with desert eyes, watching the horizon, reaching into distant lands, and turning the world's movement into the stillness of a tomb. If the pyramids make royal eternity visible from miles away, Heliopolis reminds us that Egypt's sacred power could also gather around objects small enough to fit in a hand. A bead, a mirror, a cosmetic jar, a bronze implement, a strip of gold, a dark line of coal placed around the eye. These things seem delicate beside a pyramid, almost private, yet they belong to the same world of rebirth, protection, beauty, and order. Egypt does not divide the sacred from daily life as sharply as modern minds sometimes do. The body, the face, the scent of oil, the shine of metal, the curve of an amulet, the morning sun striking a temple wall, all can take part in the maintenance of Mart. After the great state projects of the Old Kingdom, it is easy to imagine Egyptian religion only in colossal terms. But the world of the pharaohs is also made from intimate acts of preparation. Heliopolis, known to the Egyptians as Yunu, stands near the root of Egypt's solar imagination. In later Greek memory, its name means the city of the sun, and that is not an exaggeration of its importance. It is one of the great religious centres of ancient Egypt, associated above all with Ra and with stories of creation, kingship, cosmic order, and the first emergence of life from chaos. Much of ancient Heliopolis is difficult to see today because later settlement, reuse, destruction, and urban expansion have swallowed so much of it. This is one of the frustrations of Egyptian archaeology. Some of the most important places in the ancient imagination are not the most visually complete places on the modern landscape. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate details of Heliopolitan theology across different periods. But its central importance is beyond doubt. To understand Egypt's kings, one must understand why the sun matters so much. The sun is not merely a bright object in the sky. It is the daily proof that order can return after darkness. Every evening it disappears. Every morning it rises again, in a civilization obsessed with death and rebirth. This is not background scenery. It is the pattern behind everything. The dead king hopes to join the sun's cycle. The living king presents offerings so the gods continue to sustain the world. Temples are aligned, decorated, and richly activated in ways that connect stone with light, calendar, horizon, and divine presence. Ra becomes one of the great forces through which Egyptian kingship explains itself. A ruler may be Horus on earth, son of Ra, companion of the solar journey, and guardian of the cosmic rhythm that carries night into dawn. At Heliopolis, creation itself is imagined through the first mound, the first rising place, the first stable point emerging from the waters of chaos. The Benben stone, associated with this primeval emergence, becomes a powerful symbol of solar creation. Later pyramid tips and obelisks echo this vertical language, catching light and turning stone into a kind of frozen sunbeam. Again, Egyptian symbols do not operate in only one direction. A pyramid can be a tomb, a mound, a stairway. A ray of light and a political monument. An obelisk can be architecture, theology, royal propaganda, and sunlight made permanent. Heliopolis gives Egypt a vocabulary for turning dawn into kingship. This solar language grows especially important during the Old Kingdom. By the 5th dynasty, royal names increasingly emphasize Ra, and kings build sun temples that place solar worship at the center of royal ideology. These temples do not replace pyramids, but they deepen the connection between the pharaoh and the sun god. The king's afterlife and the sun's daily rebirth become intertwined, and the court's religious imagination expands beyond the hidden burial chamber toward open-air solar ritual. This is a shift in emphasis, not a clean break. Egyptian religion is rarely tidy enough for that. Older beliefs persist while new layers gather over them. The result is a theology that feels less like a single doctrine than a vast temple wall covered by centuries of additions. Yet Heliopolis is not only a city of cosmic abstraction. The 2026 discovery of a rare funerary cache in the Heliopolis necropolis helps bring the sacred down to the level of the human body. The cache reportedly included jewelry, cosmetic tools, a bronze mirror, coal containers, and amulets, objects that speak not of armies or pyramids, but of preparation, adornment, protection, and identity. These objects remind us that the dead were not imagined as bare souls floating away from the body. They needed equipment, they needed beauty, they needed magical safeguards, they needed to be recognizable, restored, and protected for the passage beyond death. A bronze mirror may seem like a simple personal object, but in Egypt it can carry deep associations. Its shine catches light, its round form can evoke the sun, its polished surface belongs to the world of appearance, transformation, and presence. Cosmetic tools and coal vessels are equally rich in meaning. Coal darkens and protects the eyes, and it may have had practical benefits against glare and infection, though its symbolic role is just as important. The lined eye is an image of alertness, health, divine beauty, and ritual completeness. In tomb contexts, cosmetics are not vanity in the shallow sense. They are part of restoration. The dead are prepared to appear whole, effective, and protected in the next world. Jewelry and amulets carry the same dual force. They are beautiful, but they are also active. An amulet is not merely decoration. It is a small technology of protection, shaped by material, colour, form, and placement. The scarab can evoke renewal and the sun's movement. The Wedjat eye can offer healing and completeness. The Jed pillar can suggest stability. The Tayet knot can link to divine protection. The meaning of each object can vary depending on period, material, context, and inscription, and no single explanation fully accounts for every object found in every burial. But the pattern is clear. Egyptians use small things to solve enormous problems. How does the dead person pass safely beyond the grave? How does the body remain whole? How does identity survive? How does one carry protection into a world no living person can inspect? This is where the rise of the pharaohs meets the lives of everyone else. Royal ideology may dominate the monuments, but the hope for survival after death spreads far beyond kings. Over time, funerary beliefs once centered on the ruler become more widely accessible, adapted through coffins, spells, amulets, shabti figures, tomb scenes, and household devotion. Egypt's afterlife becomes crowded not just with pharaohs, but with officials, priests, artisans, women and men of different ranks, families seeking continuity and communities trying to keep names alive. The pharaoh remains central to the order of the world, yet ordinary people also enter the sacred system through objects, words, offerings, and memory. The cash from Heliopolis is powerful because it belongs to this human scale. It is not only about the state, it is about hands that used a mirror, eyes that may once have been lined with coal, a body prepared with care, a burial assembled through belief and affection. The objects are quiet, but they are not minor. They show how Egyptian religion worked by joining the cosmic and the personal. The same sun that legitimized kings could gleam on a bronze mirror. The same desire for rebirth that raised pyramids could rest inside a tiny amulet. The same fear of disorder that shaped royal ritual could lead someone to place protective objects near the dead. Heliopolis, therefore, widens the story. Egypt's power is not only in stone mass, military command, or dynastic lists. It is in the ability to make the universe feel intimate. Dawn becomes a god. A tomb becomes a horizon, a painted eye becomes protection, a mirror becomes sunlight held close to the face. The pharaoh stands at the center of this system, but the system reaches outward into homes, workshops, cemeteries, and bodies. And as Egypt moves toward periods of strain, fragmentation, and recovery, these objects will matter even more. When kings weaken, when capitals shift, when dynasties fracture, the desire for order does not vanish. It survives in ritual habits, in local cults, in burial customs, in the small sacred things that people trust when great monuments can no longer guarantee the world. When great monuments stand for thousands of years, They can make the power behind them seem equally solid. The pyramid remains on the horizon. The royal name is carved in stone, and the desert preserves the outline of authority long after the hands that served it have vanished. But ancient Egypt is not an unbroken line of perfect kingship. Beneath the image of the eternal pharaoh lies a more unstable truth. Power gathers, hardens, shines, and then begins to loosen. The same system that can organize stone on a colossal scale can also strain under distance. Drought, ambition, inheritance, debt, local pride, and the ordinary difficulty of making a long country obey one center forever. Egypt's kings claim cosmic order, but their officials still have to count grain, manage labor, keep loyalty, and survive the river's moods. The end of the Old Kingdom does not arrive like a single door slamming shut. It is more like a slow dimming across a vast palace. Pyramid construction continues, but on a reduced scale. Provincial tombs become more important. Local governors, often called nomarchs by modern scholars, grow more visible in the archaeological record. Their inscriptions speak of feeding people, managing regions, protecting communities, and acting with authority that once seemed more tightly held by the royal court. The pharaoh still exists, and the idea of kingship does not vanish, but the balance shifts. The center no longer commands the whole land with the same confidence. What survives in the record suggests a world in which local power becomes harder to ignore. Scholars still debate the causes of the first intermediate period, and the evidence remains incomplete. Low Nile floods may have placed severe pressure on food supplies. Administrative burdens may have grown too heavy. Royal wealth may have been divided among competing institutions. Long reigns, succession problems, and the increasing strength of provincial families may all have contributed. Later Egyptian memory sometimes looks back on this period as an age of disorder. But those later texts are not neutral windows. They may exaggerate chaos to praise later kings who restored unity. The reality was likely uneven. Some regions may have suffered deeply. Others may have adapted under local leadership. Egypt did not simply collapse into darkness. It fragmented into a more regional world. That distinction matters. The fall of centralized power does not mean the end of civilization. Fields are still planted where water allows. Crafts continue. Burials are made. Local officials sponsor tombs. Religious life persists. Families maintain memory. Scribes still write, though not always for the same masters. The pharaoh's weakness creates space for other voices. In tomb inscriptions from provincial elites, one can sense men presenting themselves not merely as servants of a distant king, but as protectors of their own communities. They boast of giving bread, caring for people, maintaining order, and acting justly. Some of these claims are conventional, but they reveal a changed political atmosphere. When the center fades, local leaders learn to sound like miniature kings. A lesser-known detail is that this age of fracture may have helped broaden Egyptian funerary culture. During and after the Old Kingdom, ideas once focused strongly on the royal afterlife begin to circulate more widely among elites and eventually beyond them. Coffin texts, which flourish in the Middle Kingdom, preserve spells and religious possibilities that are no longer limited to pyramid chambers. The path to the afterlife becomes more accessible, though never fully equal, in that sense. Political decentralization and religious development may be linked in complicated ways. When royal power weakens, sacred knowledge does not disappear. It spreads, adapts, and finds new containers. The conflict between Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south becomes one of the defining struggles of this fractured age. Egypt, once imagined as the two lands unified under one crown, now contains rival centres claiming legitimacy. The Heracleopolitan rulers control parts of the north and middle Egypt, while Theban rulers build strength in the south. The exact sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct, because later king lists, inscriptions, and monuments preserve memory selectively, but the broad movement is clear enough. Thebes rises, and under Mentuhotep II, Egypt is reunited, beginning the Middle Kingdom. That reunification is not a simple return to the past. It is a restoration shaped by the memory of division. The idea of the pharaoh survives, but it has been tested. The Middle Kingdom presents itself as an age of renewed order, literature, fortification, irrigation projects, royal ideology, and carefully managed kingship. Pharaohs such as Senusret III project power with a different intensity from the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. This state strengthens its grip on Nubia, builds forts, expands administration, and refines royal imagery. The king is still sacred, but the tone of kingship can feel more burdened, more aware of danger. Literature from this broader era often meditates on loyalty, justice, upheaval, and the fragile nature of order. Egypt has learned that that must be actively defended, not simply assumed. Yet even this restored order does not last forever. After the Middle Kingdom, Egypt again enters a period of division, known as the Second Intermediate Period. This time the fracture includes a powerful foreign-linked dynasty in the eastern delta, remembered as the Hyksos. Their capital at Avaris becomes a major centre of rule, exchange, and cultural mixture. Older Egyptian tradition often cast the Hyksos in hostile terms, especially after native Theban rulers drove them out and built a new royal narrative around liberation. But archaeology has complicated that picture. The Hyksos were not simply an invading storm that appeared from nowhere. Their rise seems connected to long-standing movement of people from the Levant into the Delta, trade networks, settlement, and gradual political change. No single explanation fully accounts for their ascent. This makes the Second Intermediate Period especially revealing. Pharaoh's power is not only challenged by internal regional elites, it is challenged by rulers who adopt Egyptian royal forms while also bringing connections to Western Asia. The Delta becomes a place where cultural boundaries are porous. Pottery styles, burial customs, names, weapons, animals, and trade goods speak of contact and hybridity. The horse and chariot, often associated with this age, become part of the military transformation that later New Kingdom rulers use with devastating effect. The very forces that challenge Egypt help reshape it. Meanwhile, Thebes again becomes the southern counterweight. Local kings there gradually build the ideological and military energy that will lead toward reunification. But before that restoration, Egypt is a land of overlapping claims. A ruler in the Delta can call himself king. A ruler in Thebes can do the same. Nubian powers in the south matter deeply. Smaller dynasties and local authorities occupy spaces between the large names. The clean dynastic list that later historians prefer cannot capture the full complexity. Ancient Egypt during these intermediate periods is not a neat row of crowns. It is a contested landscape of courts, temples, fortresses, trade routes, and uncertain loyalties. This is where the myth of the all-powerful pharaoh breaks open. Pharaohs could command awe, but they could lose territory. They could claim divine favor, but rivals could claim it too. They could build monuments, yet monuments did not guarantee obedience. Their authority depended on food, communication, military force, elite cooperation, religious legitimacy, and the ability to persuade people that their rule was the natural shape of the world. When those supports weakened, kingship did not vanish, but it multiplied. Egypt could have more than one ruler, more than one center, more than one memory of order, and still the idea endured. That may be the most remarkable part. Even in fragmentation, rulers did not abandon the pharaonic model. They competed to inhabit it. The crown remained desirable. The language of Maat remained powerful. The divine king remained the framework through which legitimacy was expressed, even by those who ruled only part of the land. The pharaoh's authority could fracture, but the dream of unified kingship survived the fracture. That dream would soon pull Egypt back toward empire, but first it passes through shadow-forgotten dynasties, damaged tombs, uncertain names, and kings whose power once mattered intensely, then slipped almost entirely from memory. Out of that shadow comes Abydos, a place where Egypt seems to remember itself even when the country is divided, long before the kings of Thebes struggle against rivals in the north. Abydos is already ancient in Egyptian imagination. The first dynastic rulers were buried in its desert cemeteries, where names from the beginning of kingship cling to jars, seals, tombs, and fragments. Later, Abydos becomes deeply tied to Osiris, the murdered and restored god whose story gives the dead a powerful language of hope. Pilgrims come there, kings build there. Ordinary people leave memorials there, wanting some share in the sacred geography of rebirth. If Heliopolis belongs to the daily return of the sun, Abydos belongs to memory, burial, and the promise that what has been broken might be made whole again. That is why the discovery of a royal tomb at Abydos, announced in 2025 by Penn Museum and Egyptian archaeologists, carries a strange weight. It is not just another tomb in a land famous for tombs. It belongs to a period when Egypt's political map is fractured, when the clean authority of one pharaoh over the two lands is more ideal than reality. The tomb is roughly 3,600 years old, dating to the Second Intermediate Period, and it appears connected to what scholars call the Abydos dynasty, a small and still poorly understood line of rulers who may have governed part of southern Egypt between larger powers. The king remains unidentified. His name, if it once shone on a wall or coffin or burial object, has not yet given itself clearly to modern eyes. A ruler once important enough to receive a royal tomb has returned as an absence. There is something almost perfect about that. Pharaohs were built from names. Their names were enclosed, repeated, carved, painted, sealed, offered to, and protected. To erase a royal name was to wound a king's eternity. To preserve a name was to keep him active in memory. Yet here, at Abydos, archaeology finds the shape of kingship without the certainty of identity. The tomb says a king was here. The missing name refuses to say which one. The evidence remains incomplete. And scholars still debate how the Abydos dynasty fits into the wider political struggle of the Second Intermediate Period. But the discovery makes one thing clear. Egypt's history is not only the story of famous pharaohs whose names survived in temple lists. It is also the story of rulers who stood in the gaps, governed uncertain territories, built tombs, claimed legitimacy, and then nearly vanished. The Second Intermediate Period is often told through a few large forces: the Hyksos in the delta, the Theban rulers in the south, and the eventual rise of the 18th dynasty. But between these stronger lights are smaller flames. Abydos seems to have held one of them. The very existence of a local royal dynasty there suggests a political world more complex than a simple north versus south struggle. Egypt may have contained overlapping zones of control, local courts, fragile alliances, and short-lived royal houses. Some rulers may have controlled only a narrow stretch of land, yet still adopted the symbols and burial ambitions of kingship. The pharaonic idea is so powerful that even reduced power wants to wear its shape. Abydos gives such a king the right setting. To build a royal tomb, there is to place oneself in conversation with Egypt's earliest rulers and with Osiris, Lord of the Dead. It is a claim not merely to territory, but to sacred ancestry. A king who cannot command all Egypt may still claim legitimacy through the old desert of kings. He may not control Memphis or the Delta. He may not possess the wealth of the pyramid builders or the armies of the later empire, but he can build at Abydos, near the ground where kingship itself remembers its beginnings. That choice is political, religious, and emotional at once. The tomb also reminds us that collapse is rarely empty. Modern words like decline and fragmentation can make historical periods sound like blank spaces between greatness, as if nothing important happens until a stronger dynasty returns. Archaeology says otherwise. In these in-between centuries, people still build, worship, bury, trade, fight for authority, administer estates, carve seals, make pottery, and imagine the afterlife. Local rulers still need officials, temples still need offerings. Families still need continuity. Artists still work in inherited styles, sometimes with limited resources, sometimes with surprising confidence. What survives in the record suggests a world under pressure, but not a world without creativity. A lesser-known aspect of Egypt's intermediate periods is that they often preserve experimentation at the edges of centralized control. When royal authority is concentrated, official art and ideology can appear more uniform. When authority fragments, local traditions may become more visible. This does not mean life becomes better or more stable. Political uncertainty can bring hardship, insecurity, and competition. But it does mean that the archaeological record can show a wider variety of responses to crisis. Regional elites and smaller kings borrow the old language of power while adapting it to local circumstances. They imitate the great pharaohs because the great pharaohs created the only language powerful enough to make rule feel sacred. The lost king of Abydos may have lived this world of anxious horizons. To the north, Hyksos power in the Delta and Middle Egypt shapes the political field. To the south, Theban ambition grows stronger. Nubian power matters along the southern routes. Trade, diplomacy, rivalry, and military pressure all move through the land. In such a world, a small dynasty at Abydos would have needed more than a crown. It would have needed grain, soldiers, scribes, religious support, and enough recognition from local elites to remain credible. No single explanation fully accounts for how such a dynasty rose or why it disappeared, but its tomb shows that its rulers did not see themselves as minor footnotes. They built for eternity, even if eternity later misplaced their names. There is a quiet human contradiction here. The bigger kings of Egypt often tried to erase rivals or absorb them into official memory. Later royal lists can omit inconvenient rulers. Victorious dynasties prefer clean stories, and clean stories do not have much room for small kings in contested times. But archaeology has no loyalty to royal propaganda. It waits under sand and debris, then returns what written tradition chose to neglect: a tomb wall, a mud brick line, a burial chamber, a fragment of decoration, a robbed passage. These can bring back a ruler whom official memory allowed to fade. The dead are not always restored by texts. Sometimes they are restored by architecture. Abydos therefore changes the feeling of the Second Intermediate period. It becomes less like a corridor between Middle Kingdom order and New Kingdom empire, and more like a landscape crowded with competing memories. The pharaoh's power has fractured, but the desire to be pharaoh has multiplied. Each ruler tries to place himself within the sacred pattern: king, tomb, god, offering, name, eternity. Some succeed brilliantly, some become famous only to specialists, some leave almost nothing. The unknown king of Abydos stands among the last group, yet his rediscovered tomb gives him a strange second reign in modern imagination. He rules no land now, but he commands attention because his absence reveals the limits of our maps. And from Abydos, the road bends toward renewal. The forgotten king belongs to the darkness before the dawn of the new kingdom, when Theban rulers will transform regional struggle into national restoration and then imperial ambition. But his tomb warns against making that transition too simple. Egypt did not leap from collapse into greatness in one heroic motion. It moved through broken sovereignties, local claims, uncertain borders, and rulers whose names were once spoken with respect and are now lost. The rise of the 18th dynasty will be dazzling, but beneath its brilliance lie these shadow kings, buried in places like Abydos, holding fragments of pharaonic legitimacy until a stronger power gathers them into a new order. The shadow kings of Abydos stand near the edge of a much larger turning point, when Egypt begins to gather itself again from divided rule, foreign-linked power in the delta, southern ambition at Thebes, and the restless pressure of a world beyond the Nile. This is the storm before the new kingdom, but it is not a storm made from one cause. Ancient history is often flattened into a single dramatic trigger: a volcanic eruption, an invasion, a heroic war, a sudden collapse. A king with a sword in his hand. Egypt's return to unity is more complicated than that. It grows from local dynastic rivalry, trade networks, military adaptation, shifting alliances, sacred legitimacy, and the old Egyptian hunger to make the two lands one again. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a country pulled between fragmentation and memory, between the reality of competing powers and the ideal of one crown. In the north, the Hyksos court at Avaris controls the eastern delta and reaches into the political life of Lower Egypt. Later Egyptian tradition remembers the Hyksos as outsiders and enemies, and that memory shapes the victory stories of the Theban kings who eventually defeat them. Yet the archaeological picture is more layered. Avaris is not simply a camp of strangers planted suddenly in Egyptian soil. It is a major urban centre with deep Levantine connections, a place where people, goods, animals, weapons, artistic styles, and burial customs move through a busy frontier world. The Hyksos rulers adopt Egyptian royal titles and participate in Egyptian kingship, even as they preserve connections that mark them as different. Their power is both foreign and Egyptianized, both disruptive and deeply embedded in the delta. Scholars still debate the balance between migration, settlement, political takeover, and military domination. But the old picture of a single abrupt invasion has become too blunt for the evidence. In the south, Thebes grows into the centre of resistance and renewal. Theban rulers do not simply wake one morning and restore Egypt. They build power across generations, turning regional kingship into a national claim. Sekenenre Tau, Kamose, and Amose stand in the remembered sequence of this struggle, though the details are tangled by damaged texts, later retellings, and royal ideology. Thebes has advantages: access to southern resources, a strong local religious identity, control over routes, and the ability to frame its campaign as the restoration of Ma'at against disorder. That language matters. To challenge the Hyksos is not only to fight a rival court, it is to present Thebes as the place from which Egypt's proper order can be reborn. The conflict is not merely symbolic. It involves fortresses, river movement, siegecraft, weapons, and hard political calculation. The horse and chariot, composite bow, new military techniques, and broader Western Asian connections all become part of the changing landscape of power. Some of these innovations are associated with the very world in which the Hyksos flourish, which creates one of history's recurring ironies. A challenge to Egypt helps equip Egypt for a new age of expansion. The New Kingdom Empire that later projects Egyptian force into Nubia and the Levant is born partly from lessons learned during division, the experience of being threatened, hemmed in, and forced to adapt changes the state. Egypt emerges not simply restored, but sharpened. At this point, the Mediterranean world also enters the story through a famous and often misunderstood catastrophe, the eruption of Thera, the volcanic explosion in the Aegean that devastated the island of Santorini and sent effects across the eastern Mediterranean. Popular retellings sometimes attach Thera too neatly to Egyptian events, as if one eruption can explain political change, biblical memory, dynastic transition, or the rise of the new kingdom by itself. The temptation is understandable. A great volcano offers drama, ash, darkness, disturbed weather, and distant shockwaves make powerful images. But careful chronology resists easy storytelling. Recent radiocarbon work relating to the end of Dynasty 17 and the beginning of Dynasty 18 places the Thera eruption before the reign of Ahmose, making it difficult to treat the eruption as a simple direct trigger for his campaigns or for the precise moment of reunification. That does not mean Thera is irrelevant to the wider age. The eruption belongs to the same broad eastern Mediterranean world in which Egypt, the Aegean, the Levant, and Western Asia are connected by trade, diplomacy, materials, and rumour. A major volcanic event can disturb climate, movement, and societies in ways that are difficult to trace cleanly in the archaeological record. But the responsible path is to separate what is known from what is inferred. The eruption happened. It affected the Aegean profoundly. Its exact relationship to Egyptian textual memories and political history remains debated. It should not be turned into a magical explanation for Egypt's rebirth. History is rarely that generous to simple plots. Ahmose's rise at the opening of the 18th dynasty belongs more securely to the long Theban campaign against Hyksos power and to the rebuilding of centralized authority. His reign marks the beginning of the New Kingdom, one of the most extraordinary periods in Egyptian history. But even here, victory is not the end of complexity. Driving out the Hyksos is remembered as liberation, yet it also sends Egypt outward. The old inward dream of the Pyramid Age gives way to a more aggressive frontier mentality. Egypt has learned that threats can come from beyond the traditional borders, and so later pharaohs will try to control those beyond border spaces more directly. Security becomes expansion. Restoration becomes empire. This transformation changes the meaning of pharaoh. The king remains the guardian of Maat, the ritual center, the son of Ra, the builder of temples, the one whose name must endure. But now he is also more visibly a war leader on an international stage. His legitimacy is tied not only to feeding Egypt and honoring the gods, but to securing foreign lands, collecting tribute, building garrisons, and presenting distant peoples as part of an ordered world under Egyptian dominance. The ideology is old, the scale changes. The sacred smiting scene from early kingship now has new geopolitical reach. There is a human cost hidden beneath the polished royal language of restoration. War inscriptions prefer victory, divine favor, and royal courage. They do not dwell on uncertainty, exhaustion, fear, negotiation, or the ordinary lives caught between rival powers. The script of kingship turns conflict into cosmic necessity. Yet archaeology and cautious historical reconstruction remind us that political reunification is lived on the ground through shifting loyalties, military campaigns, moving families, changing administrations, rebuilt towns, and temples redirected toward new centers of authority. Egypt is not healed by decree, it is stitched back together. The storm before the new kingdom therefore has several winds. There is the internal wind of Theban ambition. There is the northern wind of Hyksos power and Levantine connection. There is the southern wind of Nubian politics and resources. There is the wider Mediterranean wind, where events like Thera remind us that Egypt's horizon is larger than the Nile, and beneath all of it is the older, deeper current. The Egyptian belief that divided rule is an injury to the world. When Thutmose and his successors claim restoration, they are not only claiming land, they're claiming that the pattern has returned. But the pattern returns changed. The pyramids of the old kingdom had looked inward toward eternity. The new kingdom will look outward toward empire. The hidden tombs of the Valley of the Kings will replace the mountain tombs of Giza. The god Amun of Thebes will rise with extraordinary force. Queens, generals, priests, and royal women will move through the story with unusual power. Egypt will become richer, more ambitious, more cosmopolitan, and more vulnerable to the very scale of its success. The storm clears, but what appears after it is not the old Egypt restored. It is a sharper, brighter, more dangerous kingdom, ready to carry the pharaoh's name far beyond the river that first made him possible. The sharper kingdom that rises after Thutmose does not forget the lesson of division. For centuries, Egypt had imagined itself as the ordered center of the world, a green corridor held between deserts, protected by gods, crowned by a king whose duty was to keep chaos at the margins. But the second intermediate period had shown that margins could move inward. Foreign-linked rulers could sit in the delta. Rival kings could claim legitimacy. Trade routes could become corridors of political pressure. When the 18th dynasty takes shape, the pharaoh's old sacred role remains intact, but his field of action expands. He must guard Egypt by reaching beyond Egypt. The result is the new kingdom, the age in which the pharaoh becomes not only a divine ruler and temple builder, but a warrior king whose monuments speak the language of empire. Thutmose begins this new age by completing the struggle against Hyksos power and reasserting Egyptian control. His reign becomes a hinge between a wounded past and an ambitious future, yet the campaigns that restore unity also open the road outward. Egypt pushes into southern lands, strengthens control in Nubia, and looks northeast toward the Levant. Military action is framed as restoration, but restoration quickly becomes strategy. A kingdom that has once been divided learns to build buffer zones. It is not enough to hold the Nile Valley if rival powers can gather just beyond it. Security becomes an argument for expansion, and expansion becomes proof that the pharaoh has restored Mayat on a broader stage. This new kingdom state is not built only on chariots and armies. It rests on administration, taxation, temple wealth, diplomacy, and the ability to move men, food, animals, metal, wood, and information across long distances. Egypt's military machine requires scribes as much as soldiers. Forts must be supplied, roads must be watched, garrisons must be paid or provisioned, captured goods and tribute must be counted, stored, redistributed, and transformed into offerings, temple endowments, royal gifts, and monuments. The pharaoh's victory scenes often reduce foreign lands to kneeling figures and neat rows of tribute, but behind that ceremonial image is a complicated network of management. Empire, like eternity, creates paperwork. Hatshepsut reveals another face of New Kingdom power. She's often remembered as a woman who ruled as king, and that fact remains extraordinary, though it should not be reduced to novelty alone. She inherits the pharaonic role and reshapes its presentation with remarkable intelligence. Her monuments at Deir el-Bahri do not emphasize conquest in the same way later military kings do. They present legitimacy through divine birth, sacred architecture, offerings to Amun, and the celebrated expedition to Punt. That expedition, likely reaching a region connected to the Red Sea trade world, brings back incense trees, exotic goods, animals, and materials that make Egypt's horizon feel vast and fragrant. A lesser-known detail is that the reliefs show the transportation of living myrrh trees, roots and all, as if Egypt is not merely importing luxury but transplanting sacred abundance into its own ritual landscape. Scholars still debate the exact location of Punt, but its importance in Egyptian imagination is clear. It is a place of divine perfume, distant wealth, and royal reach. Hatshepsut's reign also reveals how fragile memory can be even at the height of power. After her death, many of her images and names are attacked or altered, though the motives remain debated. Was this a personal vendetta by Thutmose III, a later effort to regularize succession, a political act against an unusual kingship, or a combination of factors? The evidence remains incomplete, and the old story of simple revenge is too narrow, but the damage itself is telling. A pharaoh can build in stone and still face erasure. Royal memory is a battlefield long after the ruler is gone. Thutmose III, who follows and eventually dominates the record, becomes the great warrior pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. His campaigns into the Levant, especially the famous confrontation at Megiddo, place Egypt firmly in the international politics of Western Asia. The royal inscriptions describe speed, divine favour, and tactical skill, presenting the king as the irresistible arm of Amun. The details are shaped by royal ideology, but the broader historical reality is clear enough. Egypt now operates far beyond the Nile. City-states, vassal rulers, tribute systems, diplomatic marriages, hostages of elite families, and imperial garrisons become part of the pharaoh's world. The king is not simply defending Egypt from chaos. He's organizing foreign lands into a hierarchy that benefits Egypt and glorifies its gods. This expansion changes the texture of the court. Gold from Nubia, timber from the Levant, horses, chariots, weapons, skilled crafts, diplomatic gifts, and foreign luxury objects flow into Egypt. The temples of Amun, especially at Karnak, grow enormously wealthy. The god who helped Thebes rise from regional power to national ruler becomes the divine patron of empire. Karnak is not simply a temple, it becomes a stone archive of victory, offering, and accumulation. Pharaohs enlarge it generation after generation, carving their names into pylons, halls, obelisks, chapels, and sacred precincts. To walk there is to move through centuries of royal competition, each king trying to add his own layer to the god's house and to Egypt's memory. Yet empire also brings contradictions. Foreign princes may be educated at the Egyptian court, becoming both hostages and future allies. Diplomatic letters, especially from the later Amarna archive, show that Egypt participates in a world of great kings, gifts, complaints, marriages, and delicate bargaining. Pharaohs may present themselves as universal rulers, but in practice they negotiate with other powers: Mitanni, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, and smaller Levantine states. The image of absolute dominance on temple walls sits beside a more complicated diplomatic reality. No single explanation fully accounts for New Kingdom power if one looks only at battle scenes. Egypt's empire is maintained through fear, prestige, wealth, religion, marriage, administration, and constant attention. The warrior pharaoh is therefore both a real figure and a carefully staged one. He rides in a chariot beneath the favour of Amun. He smites enemies in reliefs that repeat a formula older than the pyramids. He returns with tribute and dedicates wealth to temples. But he is also surrounded by officials, generals, scribes, priests, artisans, diplomats, and local rulers whose cooperation makes expansion possible. The king's body is magnified until it fills the temple wall, while the machinery behind him disappears into lines of smaller figures. This is how pharaonic art works. It tells the truth of ideology, not the full truth of logistics. For ordinary Egyptians, the empire may have appeared through taxes, conscription, temple festivals, foreign goods, stories of campaigns, new wealth, and the growing grandeur of sacred buildings. Most people did not stand at Megiddo or travel to Punt, but they lived in a country transformed by those distant actions. The gods' temples grew richer. Royal names multiplied across stone. Egypt's sense of itself expanded. The land that once feared fragmentation now presented itself as the force that ordered other lands. Still, greatness carries pressure inside it. The more Egypt reaches outward, the more it must maintain: armies, garrisons, temples, officials, diplomacy, and monumental building all demand resources. The pharaoh's glory is not weightless. It rests on grain, gold, labour, and loyalty. For a time, the system works with astonishing brilliance. The New Kingdom becomes the age of Hatshepsut's terraces, Thutmose III's campaigns, Karnak's expansions, and a royal confidence that seems to turn victory into theology. But under the shine, new tensions are already forming. The god Amun grows rich, the court grows complex. Foreign entanglements deepen. Royal succession remains delicate. The empire of the warrior pharaohs is powerful, but power on this scale is never still. It must keep moving, building, conquering, negotiating, and remembering why it began. The empire that Amos helped reopen and Thutmose III pushed across foreign horizons reaches, in the reign of Amenhotep III, a different kind of power. It is the heavy, golden confidence of a state that has learned to make wealth look natural. Egypt under Amenhotep III feels less like a sword being drawn and more like a sun disk held high over the Nile. Warm, blinding, and carefully polished. The army still matters. Nubian gold, Levantine diplomacy, temple estates, royal marriages, and international exchange all still move beneath the surface. But the image the king chooses to leave behind is not only conquest, it is abundance, it is splendour, it is the pharaoh as the centre of a world so prosperous that even stone seems to glow. Amenhotep III rules during one of the most opulent moments of the 18th dynasty. His reign stands near the summit before the strange turn toward Amarna, before Akhenaten unsettles the religious balance, before Tutankhamun's brief restoration becomes famous for reasons he never could have imagined. Amenhotep III is the father of Akhenaten and the grandfather of Tutankhamun, but he should not be reduced to a position in someone else's family tree. In his own time, he is a colossal presence. His monuments spread across Egypt and Nubia. His court participates in the diplomacy of great kings. What survives in the record suggests a reign intensely aware of image, ceremony, and the power of royal magnificence. The tomb of Amenhotep III in the Western Valley near Luxor, reopened in 2025 after more than 20 years of restoration, brings this grandeur into a more fragile light. The tomb had suffered damage over centuries' floods, instability, human entry, ancient disturbance, later wear, and the usual slow violence of time. Restoration does not make the past whole again, but it can make its remaining surfaces legible. Cleaned paintings, stabilized walls, studied passages, and conserved decoration allow modern visitors and scholars to see more clearly the world prepared for one of Egypt's greatest kings. There is a quiet irony in that. A ruler who filled his reign with monuments and wealth returns to modern attention through conservation work, scaffolding, pigment analysis, and patient repair. The pharaoh's eternity depends, in the end, on restorers with brushes. Amenhotep III's mortuary temple on the West Bank was once among the largest sacred complexes in Egypt, though today much of it survives in ruins, fragments, and the famous colossi of Memnon. These two-seated statues, rising from the flat land like weathered guardians, are often all that visitors remember, but they once stood before a vast temple landscape. In antiquity, the temple would have linked the living cult of the king to offerings, festivals, processions, and the sacred west where the sun descends. Its scale was not only personal vanity, it was theological architecture. The king's body would die, but his cult could continue. His image could receive offerings. His name could remain active. His monument could turn royal memory into ritual geography. A lesser-known detail is the sound once associated with one of the colossi in the Greco-Roman period. After an earthquake damaged the northern statue, it became famous for producing a mysterious sound at dawn, likely caused by temperature changes moving through cracked stone. Greek and Roman visitors connected it with Memnon and left inscriptions recording their visits. Amenhotep III's statue became Memnon's singing statue. This does not tell us what Egyptians originally intended, but it shows how monuments gather meanings long after their first world has changed. Stone survives, and strangers teach it new stories. During Amenhotep III's lifetime, however, the official story is intensely Egyptian and intensely solar. He associates himself with dazzling light, divine birth, renewal, and the favour of gods. The Aten, later so central to Akhenaten, is already present as a solar concept in his reign, though not yet in the revolutionary form it will take under his successor. Scholars still debate the extent to which Amenhotep III's religious emphasis prepared the ground for Amarna. Some see continuity, a gradual elevation of solar theology and royal divinity. Others stress the rupture that follows under Akhenaten. Amenhotep III's court magnifies the king until he approaches divine radiance. Akhenaten will take that radiance and push it into dangerous exclusivity. The king's wealth arrives in metal, stone, livestock, textiles, timber, incense, and diplomatic gifts. Letters from the broader international world of the Late Bronze Age show kings speaking to one another as brothers while bargaining hard over gold. Marriage, statues, and prestige. Egypt is rich in gold, especially through its control of Nubian sources, and other rulers know it. Gold becomes not merely a material, but a diplomatic language. To send gold is to display generosity. To withhold it is to create complaint. To cover a shrine, statue, coffin, or temple surface with gold is to bring the imperishable flesh of the gods into human sight. In Egyptian thought, gold does not tarnish like ordinary materials. It belongs naturally to divinity, sunlight, and eternal brilliance. This brilliance appears in art. Amenhotep III's reign produces refined sculpture, elegant relief, luxury objects, and monuments that present the royal family and divine world with exceptional polish. Queen Tiye, his great royal wife, appears with unusual prominence and dignity in the record. Her image and name travel through diplomacy and court display, indicating a royal woman of real political and symbolic importance. The prominence of Tiye reminds us that pharaonic power is never only the man wearing the crown. It is shaped by queens, mothers, officials, priests, generals, and foreign alliances. The king stands at the centre, but the court is a system of influence orbiting him. The Sed festivals of Amenhotep III are another window into the reign's character. Traditionally, a Sed festival renews the king's strength after long rule, allowing him to ritually demonstrate continued vitality and fitness to reign. In Amenhotep III's hands, these festivals become magnificent performances of rejuvenation. The aging king is not allowed simply to become old. He is renewed through ceremony, art, architecture, and divine association. Egypt takes the biological problem of time and answers with ritual. The pharaoh's body may weaken, but kingship must appear forever capable of rising again. Yet under all this gold is a tension that will soon matter. The temples of Amun are enormously powerful. The priesthood and estates connected to the god possess wealth and influence. The king's solar self-presentation grows brighter. Court theology becomes more elaborate. International diplomacy is delicate. The royal succession leads toward a prince who will become Akhenaten, and with him a religious experiment that unsettles the very system Amenhotep III had adorned so brilliantly. No single explanation fully accounts for the Amarna rupture, but the splendor before it is part of the story. Sometimes a system reaches its most beautiful expression just before it begins to change beyond recognition. Amenhotep III's Egypt is therefore not merely a golden age in the simple sense. It is a polished surface over deep forces, imperial wealth, temple power, royal divinization, solar theology, diplomatic entanglement, and the constant Egyptian desire to make order visible. The reopened tomb at Luxor lets us enter that world from the other side, after the splendor has passed into conservation and shadow. The king who once received foreign gifts and raised colossal statues now survives through pigments, broken corridors, restored walls, and two-seated giants that have watched the West Bank through countless dawns. His reign glows because it was powerful, but also because it stands so close to a breaking point. The sun is high, the gold is bright, and just beyond the brightness, Amarna waits. Beyond the brightness of Amenhotep III's reign, Egypt enters one of the strangest experiments in its long history. The change does not begin in darkness. It begins in a light so intense that it seems to burn away older forms of the sacred world. The prince who becomes Amenhotep IV inherits a kingdom wealthy, confident, and crowded with gods. Amun is powerful at Thebes. Ra still shines through older solar theology. Osiris waits in the west. Hathor, Ptah, Thoth, Isis, Montu, Mut, Khonsu, and countless local divine presences fill temples, household devotion, festivals, names, charms, and tombs. Egyptian religion is not a narrow system. It is a vast, layered landscape where gods overlap, merge, separate, and reappear in different forms across regions and centuries. into that crowded sacred world. The new king raises the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, until its rays dominate almost everything. At first, the movement may not have seemed like a complete rupture. The Aten was not invented from nothing. Solar worship had deep roots, and Amenhotep III's reign had already magnified the connection between kingship, radiance, and divine light. But under Amenhotep IV, who changes his name to Akhenaten, the emphasis hardens into something far more radical. The king founds a new royal city at Akhetaten, modern Amarna, on a stretch of desert plain between cliffs and river, a place presented as chosen for the Aten, the old capital at Thebes, with its immense temple wealth and priestly power, no longer occupies the same unquestioned centre. The court moves, artists change style, official religious language narrows. The king and his family become the privileged intermediaries through whom the Aten's life-giving rays reach the world. The art of Amarna is one of the first things that makes the period feel uncanny. Akhenaten's body is shown with elongated features, narrow shoulders, wide hips, a long face, full lips, and a strange softness that has inspired generations of speculation. Nefertiti appears with extraordinary elegance and authority. Royal family scenes show intimacy under the Aten's rays, with hands of light extending toward the king, queen, and their household. Popular theories have tried to explain Akhenaten's appearance through illness, genetic disorder, artistic symbolism, or deliberate theological style. Scholars still debate the meaning of the images, and the evidence remains incomplete. It is safest to treat Amarna art not as a medical chart, but as an official visual language. It reshapes the royal body to express a new religious and political imagination. That new imagination centers the king with startling force. The Aten may shine over all creation, but access to the Aten is controlled through Akhenaten. Traditional gods are reduced or attacked, especially Amun, whose name is erased in many contexts. Temples to the Aten differ from older enclosed sanctuaries because they often emphasize open courts exposed to sunlight. The darkness of the inner shrine gives way, at least in ideology, to the visible radiance of the solar disk. Offerings are made beneath the sky. Light itself becomes the divine presence. On one level, this is beautiful religion stripped to dawn, warmth, breath, growth, and the daily miracle of the sun. On another level, it is politically explosive. To elevate the Aten so sharply is also to challenge the institutions, priesthoods, festivals, and local traditions that had helped hold Egypt together for centuries. Nefertiti stands near the center of this world, not as a decorative figure but as a major religious and royal presence. Her images show her participating in offering scenes, wearing crowns, appearing at scale, and sharing the Aten's rays with the king. Her famous bust, found in a workshop at Amarna, has made her one of the most recognizable faces of ancient Egypt, though the modern beauty of that object can distract from her political importance. What survives in the record suggests she was deeply involved in the performance of Amarna kingship. Some scholars have proposed that she may have ruled as co-regent or even under another royal name near the end of the period. Though this remains debated, Amarna gives us brilliance and uncertainty in equal measure. Its records are abundant in some ways and maddeningly incomplete in others. Life in Akhetaten is not only royal theology. Archaeology reveals a city built quickly, filled with palaces, temples, elite houses, administrative zones, work areas, boundary stelae, and ordinary neighborhoods. The speed of construction matters. This was not a city slowly grown around an ancient shrine. It was a royal project, a new sacred stage imposed on the landscape. Workers, officials, craftspeople, priests, soldiers, servants, and families all moved into the orbit of the king's vision. The city's cemeteries and settlement remains have also complicated the romantic picture of Amarna as a place of pure sunlight. They show strain, labour, illness, and inequality. Though child-related suffering should be handled with care and not described graphically, the point is clear enough without cruelty. Akhenaten's radiant city was built by real bodies under real conditions, and the sunlight of theology did not erase the demands of state power. The mystery of Amarna is not simply whether Akhenaten was a visionary or a fanatic. Those modern labels are too small. He was a pharaoh using ancient tools named image, temple, city, ritual, erasure, royal family, and divine claim to reorder Egypt's sacred center. His revolution may have grown from genuine religious conviction, political struggle with the Amun priesthood, court theology inherited from his father, personal temperament, or some combination no single explanation fully accounts for. The result, however, is visible. Egypt's old religious plurality is narrowed in official spaces. The king's image becomes inseparable from divine access. A new city rises in the desert, and after Akhenaten's death, the system proves fragile. The restoration comes quickly. Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun, his name itself marking the return from Aten to Amun. The court leaves Amarna. Traditional temples regain importance. Official memory tries to heal the rupture by undoing it. Later rulers attack the Amarna king's names, dismantle buildings, reuse blocks, and remove them from certain king lists: Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and the tangled succession around them become a maze of damaged evidence and scholarly debate. The boy king Tutankhamun becomes world famous only because his tomb survives in unusually rich condition, not because his reign restored Egypt in some grand personal triumph. In his own age, he's part of a careful return to older order after a dangerous experiment. Amarna is therefore a story about broken memory. Akhenaten tried to reshape Egypt by focusing sacred life through one overwhelming solar presence. His successors tried to reshape memory by making his experiment disappear. Neither effort fully succeeded. The old gods returned, but Amarna remained buried in texts, blocks, art, names, and one abandoned city waiting in the desert. Akhenaten failed to permanently remake Egypt, yet he succeeded in leaving one of the most haunting fractures in Egyptian history. He shows that even a civilization famous for continuity could be forced into sudden ideological change. He also shows that the pharaoh's sacred power, so durable for thousands of years, could become dangerous when one king pushed it too far from the habits that made it believable. The Aten shone, the city rose, the old gods were wounded, and then Egypt stepped back from the glare, carrying scars beneath its restored temples. After Amarna, Egypt tries to make continuity look effortless again. The old gods return to their temples, the court moves back into older religious patterns. Tutankhamun's brief reign, A's careful transition, and Horemheb's military-backed restoration all work to close the wound left by Akhenaten's experiment. But a scar is not the same as untouched skin. The 18th dynasty has shone with astonishing force, then shaken itself from within. When a new royal house rises, the 19th dynasty, it inherits not a simple golden age, but a kingdom that has learned how dangerous memory can be. The Ramesside kings answer that danger with size, repetition, military display, temple building, and names carved so deeply into Egypt that even time seems forced to pronounce them. Seti I helps restore the language of authority with discipline and elegance. His reliefs at Abydos and Karnak show a state carefully renewing its links to gods, ancestors, and empire. At Abydos, his temple includes a famous king list that presents a purified royal past, skipping inconvenient rulers such as Hatshepsut and the Amarna kings. This is not forgetfulness. It is memory edited into order. Egypt does not merely remember history, it curates it. The pharaoh stands inside a chosen lineage, and anything that threatens the smooth chain can be removed from the official wall. What survives in the record suggests that restoration after Amarna required not only new policies, but a repaired story of kingship. Then comes Ramesses II, whose reign expands across Egypt like a second landscape. His statues are enormous, his temples are numerous, his name appears everywhere, sometimes on monuments he built, sometimes on monuments he appropriated from earlier kings. He rules for more than 6 decades, long enough for generations to know no other pharaoh. He becomes the pharaoh of grandeur itself, Abu Simbel cut into the Nubian cliff, the Ramesseum on the west bank, colossal seated figures, battle scenes, family images, and inscriptions that insist on victory. His Egypt is not shy. It declares itself in stone with the confidence of a ruler who understands that repetition is a form of immortality. The Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites becomes the great military drama of his reign. Egyptian accounts present Ramesses as isolated, heroic, and divinely protected, turning danger into glory through personal courage. The real battle was more complicated. It was fought in the contested world of Syria, where Egypt and the Hittite Empire competed for influence over vassal states and routes. The result was not a clean Egyptian conquest in the simple sense suggested by temple reliefs. It eventually led to one of the famous peace agreements of the ancient world, with diplomacy and royal marriage replacing endless campaigning. Scholars still debate details of the battle and its aftermath, but the larger point is clear: Ramesses knew how to turn a difficult military encounter into a permanent monument of royal triumph. This is the genius and danger of Ramesside kingship. The image grows larger as reality becomes more complex. Egypt remains powerful, wealthy, and culturally magnificent, but it exists within a crowded late Bronze Age world of rival empires, shifting alliances, mobile peoples, trade dependencies, and fragile diplomatic systems. The pharaoh can cover temple walls with subdued enemies, yet beyond the wall, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Libyans, Nubians, and Levantine city rulers all have their own ambitions. Egypt is great, but it is no longer alone in greatness. Ramesses III, in the 20th dynasty, faces a darker horizon. His inscriptions describe battles against Libyans and against groups often gathered under the modern label Sea Peoples, part of the wider upheavals that shake the eastern Mediterranean around the end of the late Bronze Age. These events are still debated intensely. No single explanation fully accounts for them. Climate stress, famine, migration, warfare, palace collapse, trade disruption, piracy, political instability, and cascading failures may all have played roles in different regions. Egypt did survive when some neighbouring palace systems collapsed, but survival is not untouched strength. Holding the gate can still exhaust the house behind it. Inside Egypt, strain becomes visible in quieter records. At Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb workers near the Valley of the Kings, texts preserve one of history's earliest known labour strikes, when workers protested because their rations were delayed. The detail is startling because it brings the grandeur of a royal burial down to bread, beer, grain, and administrative failure. These were skilled workers serving the eternity of kings, yet even they could not live on royal ideology alone. When payments failed, work stopped. The tomb of a pharaoh depended on the stomachs of living people. That small practical truth cuts through centuries of monumental boasting. The priesthood of Amun also grows into a force that can rival the crown. The temples accumulate land, wealth, personnel, and sacred authority. In earlier centuries, this had helped magnify royal power because kings enriched the gods and the gods legitimized kings. Over time, however, the balance changes. The high priests of Amun become political actors of immense importance. In the later New Kingdom and after, Egypt increasingly divides between royal authority in the north and priestly power in Thebes. The old union of palace and temple does not vanish, but it becomes less obedient to a single center. The pharaoh remains divine in language, yet his practical reach narrows. After the New Kingdom, Egypt enters the Third Intermediate Period, another age that should not be mistaken for simple darkness. Libyan-descended dynasties rule parts of Egypt. Regional powers compete and cooperate. Nubian kings from Kush eventually enter the story, ruling as the 25th dynasty, and presenting themselves not as destroyers of Egyptian tradition, but as restorers of it. Their pyramids in Sudan reveal how deeply pharaonic culture had travelled south and been transformed there. This is one of the great reversals in Egyptian history, a land long treated by pharaohs as a source of gold, soldiers, and southern prestige becomes the source of kings who claim Egypt's ancient mantle for themselves. Then come the Assyrians, the Sate revival, the Persians, the brief return of native rule, the conquest of Alexander, the Ptolemies, and finally Rome. The long fading of native pharaonic power is not a single fall from a single height. It is a series of adaptations, recoveries, humiliations, revivals, and reinventions. Persian and Greek rulers present themselves through Egyptian forms. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom, stands at the far end of this chain. A Macedonian Greek queen who understands that to rule Egypt one must still speak, at least symbolically, in the language of the pharaohs. When Rome absorbs Egypt after her death, the ancient office does not end with a dramatic collapse of pyramids or temples. It is absorbed into empire, slowly transformed, and eventually emptied of its old political force. Yet the pharaohs do not disappear when their power fades. Their symbols survive because they were never only administrative titles. They are images of order, rebirth, divine light, and the dream that one body might hold a whole world together. Ramesses II's statues still stare across the landscape. Ramesses III's reliefs still turn border crisis into cosmic victory. Priests, foreign kings, Nubian rulers, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all learn that Egypt's old forms carry power even when the old state is gone. The rise of the pharaohs had begun with graves at the desert edge. Their fall is stranger. They do not simply fall. They are copied, borrowed, restored, invaded, renamed, and finally preserved as memory after authority drains away. The crown loses the world, but the image remains. The image remains after the crown loses the world, a seated king in stone, a painted goddess with wings outstretched, a gold mask made for a young ruler who never expected to become the face of ancient Egypt, a broken cartouche found in debris, a tomb corridor cleaned after centuries of flood damage, a fragment of bone carrying chemical secrets older than empire. The pharaohs no longer command armies, tax harvests, raise obelisks, or send expeditions into deserts for stone and gold. Yet their presence has not withdrawn. It has changed location. Once, their power lived in palaces. temples, court ceremonies, frontier forts, and tombs sealed against the western cliffs. Now it lives beneath glass, under conservation lights, inside databases, in museum galleries, in excavation reports, in restored tombs, in the careful work of people who spend years making a single, damaged wall speak again. The Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza belongs to this newest afterlife. It stands not as a tomb, but as a modern house of memory facing the same pyramid landscape where Old Kingdom kings once made stone into eternity. Its halls gather objects that were never meant to meet this kind of audience: royal statues, ritual equipment, vessels, coffins, jewellery, tools, furniture, fragments of temples, and the astonishing burial world of Tutankhamun. The full display of Tutankhamun's collection gives modern visitors something even the ancient Egyptians never intended the chance to see. In one assembled vision, the equipment of a king's afterlife as a historical story rather than a sealed sacred system. The objects were made to protect one royal body and serve one royal transformation. Now they explain an entire civilization to people who arrive with phones, tickets, headphones, and questions. That contrast is quietly powerful. A golden shrine that once stood in a dark burial chamber now stands in a public institution. A bed shaped with divine animals, a chariot, a throne, sandals, jewellery, weapons, boxes, alabaster vessels, and guardian statues are no longer hidden around a dead king. They are arranged in the open, where millions can study the craftsmanship and wonder how much thought, labour, and belief could gather around a young pharaoh's death. Tutankhamun was not Egypt's greatest ruler in life. He did not build the largest pyramid, command the longest reign, or create the strongest empire. But because his tomb survived with so much of its equipment intact, he became the accidental ambassador of pharaonic eternity. History sometimes chooses its witnesses by survival, not by importance. Modern Egypt's museums and restorations also remind us that archaeology is not only discovery, it is care. The reopening of Amenhotep III's tomb after more than 20 years of restoration shows how fragile even royal grandeur can be. The tomb had to be stabilized, studied, cleaned, and protected before its remaining beauty could be seen again. The 2025 identification of Thutmose II's tomb shows the same truth from another angle. A king's burial can survive not as treasure but as damage. Flood marks, broken decoration, vessel fragments, and clues strong enough to restore a name to a place. The pharaohs tried to control memory through stone, gold, ritual, and secrecy. Modern archaeology often recovers memory through patience, not spectacle. Science has added another layer to this recovery. Ancient DNA, radiocarbon dating, CT scans, residue analysis, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, digital epigraphy, isotopic studies, and conservation chemistry are changing how Egypt's past is read. The 2025 genome from an Old Kingdom individual at Nuweirat is important, not because one person can represent all of ancient Egypt, but because it opens a rare biological window into a period usually known through monuments and texts. It suggests a world connected to North Africa, and also linked, in part, with populations toward the Fertile Crescent. That fits the wider archaeological picture. Egypt was never sealed away from its neighbours. It was a river civilization in motion, absorbing, exchanging, trading, adapting, and transforming what came from beyond its borders. Radiocarbon work on the Thera eruption and the end of the 17th dynasty also shows how modern science can protect history from overly simple stories. A volcano may be dramatic, but drama is not chronology. The careful placement of events matters because Egypt's transformations were rarely caused by one catastrophe alone. The rise of the new kingdom came from political struggle, military adaptation, regional rivalry, religious legitimacy, and generations of Theban ambition. Science does not remove mystery from the story. It sharpens the mystery by forcing it to stand on firmer ground. And still, uncertainty remains everywhere. Scholars still debate the full meaning of Amarna, the precise motives behind attacks on Hatshepsut's memory, the origins and structure of shadow dynasties, the scale of migrations into Egypt, the reasons for Old Kingdom decentralization, the details of New Kingdom diplomacy, and the slow fading of pharaonic power under foreign rule. The evidence remains incomplete because Egypt's past is enormous, damaged, selective, and unevenly preserved. Some kings built too much and still left questions. Others built little and almost vanished. Some tombs were robbed, some flooded, some were reused. Some were forgotten so thoroughly that modern discovery feels like resurrection. The rise and fall of Egypt's pharaohs is therefore not a simple arc from primitive beginnings to golden greatness to decline. It is a longer, stranger rhythm. Early rulers learn that death can be made political. The Nile teaches order. The first god-kings bind land, sky, tomb, and temple into one sacred system. The Pyramid Age turns royal afterlife into architecture on a scale the world still struggles to absorb. Periods of fragmentation reveal that Pharaoh's power can break. Yet the idea of Pharaoh remains desirable even to small kings and foreign rulers. The new kingdom transforms restoration into empire. Amenhotep III makes wealth shine. Akhenaten pulls Egypt into solar rupture. Ramesses II carves his name into landscape and memory. Later kings, priests, Nubians, Libyans, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all inherit pieces of the pharaonic form until the office loses its ancient force, but not its fascination. What survives beneath glass and sand is not merely the story of rulers. It is the story of a civilization that tried, with unmatched persistence, to resist disappearance. It placed names in cartouches, bodies in tombs, gods in temples, kings under painted skies, and offerings before the dead. It imagined time as something that could be renewed if rituals were correct and memory remained active. It failed, again and again, because no civilization defeats time completely. But it also succeeded in a way few cultures ever have. The pharaohs are gone, yet their world is still being opened, restored, tested, argued over, and reimagined. The tomb is damaged, the museum is full, the desert is not finished speaking. The long story slows here, not because Egypt has given up its secrets, but because the light is lowering over the western cliffs. The Nile continues northward, as it did before the first crowns, before the first royal tombs, before any king dreamed of a pyramid or a painted ceiling filled with stars. Fields change hands. Cities rise over older cities. Temples lose their roofs. Statues fall, are buried, lifted, named, and placed beneath careful lights. A king once called eternal becomes a label beside a glass case. A broken object becomes evidence. A forgotten tomb becomes a doorway back into the human need to be remembered. The pharaohs tried to make death orderly. They built chambers for the journey, filled them with spells, sealed them with stone, and trusted that names could cross the dark. But the gentlest truth left by Egypt is that memory never survives exactly as planned. It drifts, it breaks, it hides in sand, it waits in a flooded passage, in a restored wall, in a gold surface darkened by age, in a line of stars painted by someone whose own name is gone. The rulers who claim the horizon now belong to it. They are part of the desert's evening colour, part of the museum's quiet, part of the questions that return whenever a new tomb opens. And perhaps that is why Egypt still holds the mind so gently for so long. It is not only the size of the pyramids, or the gold of Tutankhamun, or the strange beauty of gods with animal heads and human gestures. It is the feeling that a vanished world came closer than most to touching eternity, and still could not hold it completely. The pharaohs rose, ruled, fractured, returned, expanded, glittered, weakened, and disappeared into history. Yet something of them remains, not as living kings, but as traces of longing, a name, a river, a star ceiling, a silent face beneath glass, a desert valley where the past is never entirely past.